Hello and welcome. My name is Maxim Shrayer. I am a professor at Boston College and an associate at the Davis Center, where I have the pleasure of chairing the seminar on Russian and Eurasian Jewry. And before I introduce this afternoon's illustrious speaker, Professor Francine Hirsch, I just wanted to mention that we have another great event next week. We're going to have Michael Stanislavski of Columbia, who will be speaking about Isaac Babel's diary as ego document. So I invite you all to join us next week. And now it gives me really immense pleasure to introduce Francine Hirsch, whom I've never met in person, but with whom I have communicated on various occasions and whose work I admire tremendously. She is Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And also this year, she is a virtual visiting senior scholar at the Davis Center. At the University of Wisconsin, Professor Hirsch teaches courses on Soviet history, modern European history, and the history of human rights. She received her PhD in history from Princeton University in 1998. Her first book, Empire of Nations: Ethnographic Knowledge and the Making of the Soviet Union, received a number of awards, including the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize of the American Historical Association and the Wayne Vucinic Prize of the Association of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Her second book, which has actually garnered a whole wreath of awards by now, is Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal after World War II. And today, Professor Hirsch will be speaking on a topic related to her book. I also want to mention that her current book project investigates the history of Russian-American entanglement with a focus on economics, science, culture, and international law. And Francine, before I turn the floor over to you, I just also wanted to mention that there is a special mournful timeliness to the topic of your presentation, because this summer and fall of 2021 marks the 80th anniversary of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, of the disastrous early months of the war, during which, of course, the Shoah became the Shoah on the occupied Soviet territories. Many of us think of Babi Yar, where in September of 1941, about 30,000 Jews were murdered. But of course, every town and city in the Soviet Union had a yar, a ravine, a natural depression, an anti-tank ditch of its own, where in those early months of the Nazi invasion, German and Austrian soldiers and officers and their accomplices from the local populations were murdering, annihilating the Jewish community. And I think it's important that we keep this in perspective. So thank you so much, Francine, for agreeing to speak for us. The topic of Professor Francine Hirsch's lecture is Bearing Witness at Nuremberg, the Soviet Contribution to the Record of the Holocaust. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really would like to thank you, Maxime, for the invitation to be here today, and the Davis Center as well. And yeah, I'm a virtual visiting fellow at the Davis Center this year, and just really enjoying being part of the community. So I'm gonna share my screen with you. So let me get that up here first. And okay, so let's begin. So my plan for today is as follows. I'm going to actually start with a brief overview of my book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, and I'll then turn to the question of bearing witness, discussing the role of the Soviets in making the Nuremberg Trials happen and the Soviet contribution to the record of the Holocaust. And as I go along, I'll be focusing in on two individuals, the Soviet Jewish lawyer, Aaron Trainin, and the Yiddish poet, Avraham Sutzkever. Along the way, I'll also discuss the question of historical memory, asking why key Soviet contributions have been forgotten. So let me start with the overview. My book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, presents a new history of the International Military Tribunal, or IMT. This was the first of the Nuremberg Trials, which took place from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946 at the Palace of Justice in occupied Germany. And it would turn out to be the only four-power one, the only four-power of the Nuremberg Trials. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the four major Allied powers, they tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, and they tried them for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. Now, Nuremberg is typically remembered as an American triumph and as an American story, with very little attention to the contribution of the Soviet Union. And my book aims to bring the Soviets fully into the picture. It draws on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do so. And the materials I looked at include things like the protocols of the meetings of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions, things like secret telegrams from Nuremberg to Moscow and back, also letters, diaries, and surveillance reports from the Soviet correspondents and diplomats in Nuremberg, and other things like marked up copies of the judgment and the indictment that the Soviets secretly smuggled back to Moscow for review and approval, along with things like lists of possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution and their depositions. My book shows this tremendous Soviet contribution to the trials, as well as the many ways in which Soviet participation threatened to undermine the IMT's legitimacy right from the very beginning. It also aims to use the Soviet experience and the Soviet archives, combined with a variety of other sources, to tell a richer story of the Nuremberg trials as a whole, looking at the relationship among all 4 powers, among all 4 prosecution teams, among all 4 judges with their alternates. It really opens things up. We see that Nuremberg wasn't just a struggle between the prosecution and the defense. It was also a contest among the 4 countries of the prosecution, among the 4 Allied powers, right? For power and influence and control over the narrative of the war. I'll say a few brief words now just about the narrative arc of the book. The book begins during the darkest days of the war. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing in on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter, which set out the IMT's legal framework, and about the indictment, which set out the charges. It then retells the story of the trials, capturing the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, and the judgment, which to the dismay of the Soviets included several acquittals. It ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath, looking at its legacy in the post-war period. One of my aims with the book was to tell a good story and to introduce readers to a new cast of characters. We see Nuremberg and the trials through the eyes of people like the Soviet documentary filmmaker Roman Karman and the political cartoonist Boris Efimov. We see some of them, like Karman, had been embedded with the Red Army during the war and had witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps, and they bring that experience with them into the Nuremberg courtroom. We see the outsized role of Andrei Vyshinsky, deputy foreign minister and head of one of the Soviet Union's 2 secret Nuremberg commissions. Vyshinsky had earlier been the chief prosecutor in the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938, major show trials that Stalin had used to take down his political enemies. And although Vyshinsky spent just 1 week in Nuremberg, his influence was constant for the Soviet delegation. We get to know also witness survivors, people like Avraham Sutskever, whose testimony was critical for the Soviet prosecution and for the Nuremberg trials as a whole. And we see the critical role of Soviet lawyers like Aaron Trainin from Moscow's Institute of Law in shaping the IMT's framework. Well, let's turn now to Aaron Trainin and to one of the key arguments of the book, which is, without the Soviet push for an international tribunal and without Soviet ideas about international criminal law, the Nuremberg trials likely would never have happened. The creation of the IMT is often portrayed as a triumph of purely liberal ideas about justice and the law, and as a triumph of Western, largely American leadership. This is part of the Nuremberg myth that coalesced as the Cold War developed, and it continues to this day. But it was actually the Soviets who were out in front during the darkest days of the war, pushing for a special international tribunal, as they called it, to try Nazi leaders. They were prompted in part by the sheer brutality of the Nazi occupation, and also by the idea of reparations. Now, the Americans and the British, they were actually slow to come on board. The US government worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war. The British argued that the crimes of the Nazi leaders were far too serious for a trial and pushed instead for punishment by executive decree, punishment without a legal process. For the Soviets, though, a public trial, a public reckoning was absolutely key. The Soviets, they went down their own path. They created their own War Crimes Commission, the Extraordinary State Commission that gathered and publicized evidence of Nazi atrocities. And the Soviet lawyer, Shrayer, put forward critical arguments about the criminal responsibility of the Nazi leaders, arguments that shaped the international conversation about Nazi war crimes. Shrayer initially set out his arguments in a report for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This report was turned into a book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites. So what were Shryer's arguments? I'll just mention a couple of them right now. One of them was Shrayer argued that Nazi leaders could and should be tried for participating in a criminal conspiracy. He also argued that the planning and waging of wars of aggression, wars of conquest, should be punished as crimes against peace. And it was Shrayer who coined this key term. Now, Shryer's book made its way across Europe to London, where it was translated into English and discussed by the United Nations War Crimes Commission, the UNWCC. It then crossed the Atlantic to the United States, where it ultimately landed at the White House. Now, Shrayer was not the only lawyer arguing for the criminality of aggressive war. But whereas many European and American lawyers expressed unease about ex post facto or retroactive law, the Soviets had no such reservations. After the victory, when the other Allied powers came around to the idea of an international tribunal, Shrayer was one of the two representatives that the Soviets sent to London to negotiate the Nuremberg Charter. Crimes against peace was one of the three categories of crimes set out in the Charter's Article 6, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. A fourth category, conspiracy, was added to the indictment and made into count one. Now, the Soviets, of course, had their own ideas about what a special international tribunal would look like, and it's worth reflecting on that a bit here. The Soviets took Nazi guilt as a given, and they were expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. They wanted Nuremberg in order to bear witness, but they planned to do so in a very specific way. They intended to demonstrate Nazi guilt and to tell a story about Soviet suffering and Soviet heroism. Soviet expectations and aims about what Nuremberg would be like shaped their choice of personnel. Almost all members of the Soviet legal team at Nuremberg, including Soviet Chief Prosecutor Roman Rudenko and Soviet Judge Yona Nikitchenko, were connected also to the Soviet show trials of the 1930s, along with Vyshinsky. The Soviets thought that the victors would control the script at Nuremberg, just as the prosecution had done in Soviet show trials like the Moscow trials and in the Soviet Union's own war crimes trials like the Kharkov trial of December 1943. They certainly didn't expect the defendants to be allowed to take the stand in their own defense or to be allowed to call witnesses. The Soviets were so confident of the victors controlling the script that they thought that they could use the IMT to blame one of their own atrocities on the Nazis, the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish prisoners of war. They insisted on including Katyn in the indictment as a German war crime. Now, this seems completely reckless in retrospect, but the Soviets, again, they truly believed that the defendants would not be allowed to challenge the prosecution's evidence. Suffice to say, things did not go as planned. The Soviets also didn't anticipate how much they'd have to wrangle with the other countries of the prosecution for control over the narrative and the memory of the war, and also for the spotlight. Nuremberg was, of course, a four-power trial. And before the IMT convened, the four countries of the prosecution divided up responsibility for presenting the four main charges. The Americans claimed responsibility for the conspiracy charge, count 1. The British claimed responsibility for crimes against peace, count 2. The Soviets and the French together were given war crimes and crimes against humanity, counts 3 and 4, with the Soviets focusing in on the German-occupied East. Soviet plans for presenting their part of the case evolved over time, which brings us to the other Soviet contribution that I want to discuss. The Soviet contribution to the documentary record of the Holocaust, or what at the time was talked about as Hitler's final solution. This Soviet contribution is often overlooked, in part because earlier Soviet war crimes trials, like the Kharkov trial, spoke of crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, even when the victims were Jews. But in fact, even during the war, the Soviets were collecting and publicizing evidence of the Nazi campaign to wipe out Europe's Jews. They publicized evidence through their Extraordinary State Commission and through the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which the Soviets created in 1941 to raise Western support and Western funds for the Soviet war effort. They also publicized evidence directly through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In December 1942, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a report on the implementation of the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. That's what it was called. And I'll quote a bit from it. So they voiced solidarity with the European governments in exile, which were also calling for a reckoning. And then they called attention to what they said was the bloody orgy of extermination. That's the wording, the bloody orgy of extermination being carried out against the Jews in Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and other regions of the Soviet Union. The report was printed in the major Soviet newspapers and distributed in English abroad. So later, also at Nuremberg, the Soviet prosecution and its eyewitnesses presented a horrific and at times deeply personal picture of the Nazi campaign against Europe's Jews. So in other words, they're starting to publicize information early on during the war, and then this will ultimately become a part of the Soviet case at Nuremberg. But it didn't start out as part of the Soviet case at Nuremberg. And that's what I want to talk about now, how the selection of witnesses evolved over time. First of all, it was not a given that the Soviets would call eyewitnesses. Soviet leaders had been considering having the Soviet prosecution build its case on documents alone. They began the work, though, of identifying possible witnesses for Nuremberg just in case. The Soviet security apparatus, which included the NKVD, and the state procurator's office, and the local branches of these organizations, they began screening potential witnesses in October 1945, around the same time that everyone was working on the indictment. And the archival materials on this from the Soviet archive, they're really great. We know that the investigators were looking for witnesses who fit 6 different categories. Witnesses to the murder of children, witnesses to the murder and cruel treatment of prisoners of war, witnesses to the deportation of civilians, witnesses to the destruction of cities, witness soldiers who had been the first to enter ruined cities and villages, and also possible German witnesses. And so this is part of a secret memoranda. In early November 1945, a special Soviet indictment commission headed by Andrei Vyshinsky sorted through dozens of lists with hundreds of potential witnesses from every region of the Soviet Union. In mid-November, the indictment commission drew up a draft list of 80 eyewitnesses who could provide, and in quotes from the documents, needed testimony, and who were considered politically reliable. But when the IMT opened on November 20th, 1945, Soviet leaders were still undecided about sending witnesses. On November 28th, the Politburo Commission for the Nuremberg Trials, this is the other secret Nuremberg Commission, and that met in the Kremlin, it approved a draft list of 25 witnesses to be sent to Nuremberg, and again, quoting from the document, in case of necessity. 5 of these witnesses were public figures who had worked with the Extraordinary State Commission to gather evidence of Nazi atrocities. And they included people like the director of the State Hermitage Museum in Leningrad, Joseph Orbeli. These 5 were summoned to Moscow immediately to prepare their testimony. The other 20 witnesses on this list would await further screening by the NKVD. Soviet leaders, though, they didn't make the final decision to send witnesses to Nuremberg until January 1946, when Soviet Chief Prosecutor Rudenko was back in Moscow for the holiday break and meeting with Stalin and other Soviet leaders. Soviet leaders decided at that point to send 2 high-ranking German generals, who were Soviet prisoners then, to testify about the Nazi plan to invade the Soviet Union. They were Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and General Erich Buchenhagen. They also decided to send 9 eyewitnesses to testify about Nazi war crimes and crimes against humanity. So something happened for Stalin to overcome his ambivalence, right, about sending the witnesses. And I think part of what happened was that it became absolutely clear that the Soviets would need to breathe new life into their case. The 4 countries of the prosecution presented their cases one at a time, and the Soviets were set to go last sometime in February. So the Americans started, then the British, and then the French went in January, and then the Soviets went in February. The US prosecution, which had gone first, meanwhile had used its presentations on the conspiracy charge on count 1 to significantly expand its own case. US Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson had argued that conspiracy was the key charge, the linchpin of the entire case. And he and his team had presented key evidence that the Soviets had been planning to introduce, especially on things like war crimes and crimes against humanity, which again, they're arguing that this is part of the conspiracy charge too. The US prosecution also called a number of witnesses to testify, also to testify about war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Soviet Union. So the US prosecution called people like SS General Otto Ohlendorf, who had commanded Einsatzgruppe D, a mobile execution squad that had operated in Ukraine. And Ohlendorf testified about the murder of Jews and communists and had given details, lots of details about Hitler's plans for the final solution. Okay, well, let's go now to the Soviet case and to the Soviet witnesses and who they were. The Soviet prosecution began presenting its case on Friday, February 8th, 1946. Soviet Chief Prosecutor Roman Rudenko gave the Soviet opening speech, and then he and his team began to present the Soviet evidence. The Soviet prosecution called Paulus and Buchenhagen, the German generals, to testify on February 11th and 12th, and their testimony, from all accounts, was a complete sensation. Paulus was a surprise witness. Everyone was shocked to see him. They were shocked by just the fact that he was there and speaking so openly about Barbarossa plan and other details of the German plans. So on February 18th then, like a week later almost, as the Soviet case is continuing in Nuremberg, back in Moscow, a group of 10 eyewitnesses is getting ready to leave. They leave on February 18th that evening. They leave Moscow for Nuremberg with a planned stop in Berlin. So who were the 10 witnesses that the Soviets ultimately chose to send to Nuremberg? The group of eyewitnesses included the head of the Hermitage Museum, Orbeli, as well as a Russian Orthodox priest and a professor of ancient Russian art. And all 3 of them had served on the Extraordinary State Commission, and they were being sent to Nuremberg to testify about the German destruction of culture. The group also included 2 Red Army soldiers, including one of them was a doctor, Yevgeny Kivelisha. And both of them had been imprisoned in internment camps and could testify about the abuse of Soviet prisoners of war. The group also included 4 witness survivors, and that's how they're described. Witness survivors, and they happen to be of different nationalities. And they're being sent to potentially testify about atrocities against Soviet civilians. They include a Ukrainian woman who had survived Auschwitz, a Belarusian woman who had survived Majdanek and had witnessed the murder of Belarusian children, so she fit into that category that they had slated, a Russian peasant, Yakov Grigoriev, who had witnessed the razing of his village, the burning down of his village in central Russia, and a Jew from Kiev, David Budnik, who had escaped from Babi Yar. There's a 10th eyewitness, though. The 10th eyewitness, Avraham Sutzkever, was a very late addition to this group. He had not appeared on any of the earlier lists of witnesses. Now, many of you here know Sutzkever's biography, but I want to take you through and note some key moments from the time of the war. Sutzkever had been interned in the Vilna ghetto in September 1941. And here's a picture of him with a friend in the Vilna ghetto. And he was interned there with his wife, Fredke. The Sutzkevers escaped 2 years later, and they joined a group of partisans in the forests of northwestern Belarusia. Before their escape, Sutzkever had smuggled out some of his poems, which reached the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in Moscow. The writer Ilya Ehrenberg, who was a member of this committee, had recognized Sutzkever as an ideal witness survivor. And in March 1944, Soviet leaders had airlifted the Sutzkevers out of German-occupied territory and taken them back to Moscow. And here they are after the rescue. In Moscow, Sutzkever worked with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to compile evidence for the Black Book, a massive compilation documenting German atrocities against the Jews in the occupied Soviet Union. Now, Soviet leaders had been contemplating using the Black Book as evidence at Nuremberg. It had not been published by this point. But at some point, they decided instead to send Sutzkever in person. The NKVD did not actually interview Sutzkever until February 17th, the day before the group of 10 eyewitnesses left Moscow for Germany. We don't know why exactly the Soviets decided to send Sutzkever. I haven't seen documents indicating the specific reasons, but the decision may well have been prompted in part by the French witness testimony. The French prosecution had called a number of concentration camp survivors who had given very personal, very moving testimony. It had made a deep impression on the Soviets, on the members of the Soviet prosecution team, and on the Soviet correspondents. So that might have had something to do with it. What we do know is that Sutzkever was sent then specifically to testify about the Nazi murder of the Jews. The trip from Moscow to Germany was difficult. There were delays because of a blizzard that sort of traveled with them. And the witnesses ended up arriving in Nuremberg 3 days late. They arrived on the night of Thursday, February 21st. They were so late that the Soviet prosecution had had to present large parts of its case on war crimes and crimes against humanity without them. Before going to bed on the night of his arrival, Sutzkever wondered anxiously if he would be called upon to testify at all. In a diary entry, he expressed faith, and I'll quote him here, that Nuremberg would be remembered as the place where those who had ordered the extermination of the Jewish people would be judged as criminals. The Soviet prosecution continued its case now over the next week, calling some of the witnesses who had arrived along the way. Orbieli, the director of the Hermitage Museum, he testified about the destruction of culture. The Red Army doctor, Kivelisha, he testified about the murder and abuse of prisoners of war. The Russian peasant, Igor Grigoriev, he testified about crimes against civilians. Sutzkever, meanwhile, waited. Then on Tuesday, February 26th, Soviet Assistant Prosecutor Lev Smirnov gave a presentation on the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jews. Smirnov introduced shocking documents, including a report from the commanders of Einsatzgruppe A, bragging, and I'll quote from it now, bragging about having fulfilled orders to eliminate the Jews to the fullest possible extent in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The following morning, Smirnov brought in evidence from Eastern Europe, including a Polish government report stating, and I'll quote from this now too, that 3 million Jews have been exterminated in Poland. Smirnov then called Sutzkever to the witness box. And I'd like to step back now and read a few paragraphs from chapter 8 of my book. Okay. Avraham Sutzkever had spent a couple of fitful days and sleepless nights nervously waiting to testify. The responsibility of representing the Jewish people weighed on him heavily. Will I pass the exam? Will I fulfill my mission properly for history, for my people? God only knows, he had written in his diary. Now, before the courtroom, the poet was visibly overcome with emotion. Unlike the other witnesses, he remained standing in the witness box, as if, he later wrote, it had been a matter of reciting Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. Sutzkever's voice trembled and his body shook as he told the court about the operations of the Einsatzgruppen in Vilna. He described how in the autumn of 1941, the manhunters of the SD had barged into Jewish homes day and night, dragging men away to the nearby village of Ponary, most of whom were never heard from again. He also spoke of the pogrom that the Germans had initiated in July 1941. Even before the Vilna Ghetto was organized that August, half of the city's Jewish population had been murdered, he attested. Before the occupation, some 80,000 Jews had lived in Vilna, Sutzkever emphasized. At the end of the war, there were only 600 left. The most harrowing part of Sutzkever's testimony was his recounting of the murder of his newborn son. An order had been issued in the ghetto in late December 1941, forbidding Jewish women to bear children. Around that time, Sutzkever's wife gave birth to a boy in a ghetto hospital. The Jewish doctors hid the baby and other newborns in one of the rooms, but German soldiers heard their cries and burst in. When Sutzkever's wife heard the commotion, she ran to the room. She saw one German holding the baby and smearing something under its nose. Afterwards, he threw it on the bed and laughed. Sutzkever told the court when that he arrived to the hospital a short time later, his baby was dead. He was still warm. Sutzkever had testified for almost 40 minutes, and he was spent, shaken to the core, as he wrote in his diary. He was consumed by both his own suffering and his desire for vengeance, but also strengthened by the knowledge that the Jewish people had survived, heartened by the ardent, intense feeling that no power of darkness is able to annihilate us. He considered it a matter of Jewish destiny that he, a Yiddish poet, had survived to judge Alfred Rosenberg and Hans Frank in Nuremberg, and through them, all who had adhered to their ideology. Okay, so that's some of that is from Sutzkever's testimony in court, and some of it is from his diary entry of how he was experiencing those moments. Sutzkever, he was not the only witness for the Soviet prosecution to testify about the Holocaust. Late in the game, the Soviets also added 2 witnesses sent to Nuremberg by the Polish government, Samuel Rajman and Severina Smagdlewska. Rajman, who had helped to lead the Treblinka uprising, also testified about the annihilation of the Jews. Now, the Soviet Union was representing Poland in the Nuremberg trials and also representing Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So it's not surprising that the Soviet prosecution would then include those additional 2 witnesses from Poland. But it is notable that the Soviets called the 2 witnesses from Poland and Sutzkever instead of the Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Jewish witness survivors from the Soviet Union. The two witnesses who testified about the Holocaust, in fact, were Jewish, but not Soviet. Rajman was a Polish citizen. Sutzkever had spent part of his childhood in Siberia, but his family had moved to Vilna in 1921. And Vilna, of course, had changed hands between Lithuania and Poland. And by 1946, it was part of Soviet-controlled Lithuania, but Sutzkever didn't grow up in Soviet-controlled territory. But a Jew and a partisan, who had worked with the Soviet Union's Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, Sutzkever understood that he was speaking for the Jewish people while also testifying on behalf of the Soviet Union. Rajman's and Sutzkever's testimonies played a powerful role for the Soviet prosecution and for the IMT as a whole. Through their testimonies, the Soviets were able to integrate the story of the annihilation of the Jews into a larger narrative about Nazi crimes against humanity in the occupied East. They were also able to bring meaning to the numbers. Okay, let's take a sip of water here. Okay, so Sutzkever and Rajman, Jewish, but not Soviet. At the same time, there were a number of Soviet Jews who were part of the Soviet delegation in Nuremberg. And I've wondered a lot along the way about their experiences, right? How did they experience things? And these include, again, people that we've mentioned already, correspondents and cultural figures like Boris Efimov and Roman Karman, and lawyers like Aaron Chainin. Those men, they had been sent to Nuremberg because they were loyal Soviet citizens. But we also know that Soviet leaders paid attention to the nationality of the members of the press corps, at least, and looked to include representatives of those peoples that had suffered the most. And there's actually a quote in a document that explains this at the hands of the Nazis. But what about these men themselves? What about Efimov and Karman and Chainin? Did they see the war and the Nuremberg trials? Did they experience all of this through Soviet Jewish eyes, to quote the late David Schneer, who has written an incredible book about Karman and some others? Well, there are no sweeping answers here, but I'd like to use most of the rest of my time now to think out loud with you a bit about one member of the Soviet delegation who I've already introduced you to, Chainin. Aaron Moishe Nomovich Chainin was born to a Jewish merchant family in 1883 in the town of Vitebsk in the Pale of Settlement. He entered Moscow University in 1903 to study law and political economy. Chainin's early career was shaped by being Jewish. As a young man, he wrote about the plight of Russia's Jews, using statistics to discuss the impoverishment of the Jews of the Pale of Settlement. He pursued a law degree, in fact, because he was interested in issues of social justice. Chainin graduated from Moscow University in February 1909 and remained attached to its criminal law department. Before 1917, he published numerous articles in Novy Put, a leftist journal dedicated to questions of Jewish life. Chainin did not join the Communist Party, but after 1917, he ably and eagerly served the new government. And his career had its ups and downs, but it was shaped most significantly by having Andrei Vyshinsky, whom he had met at Moscow University, as his mentor, let's just say. In the decade before World War II, Chainin reinvented himself, in fact, as an international law expert at Vyshinsky's bidding. Well, we've already discussed the importance of Chainin's book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites, for shaping the legal framework of the Nuremberg Trials, right? The book's most important contribution was the idea of crimes against peace. But Chainin clearly understood what the Nazi invasion meant for Russia's Jews. The Nazis occupied his hometown of Vitebsk in 1941 and wiped out the 16,000 Jews who lived there. In The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites, Chainin wrote at length about crimes against peaceful citizens, right? But upon careful reading, right, he also he also wrote specifically about Jewish victims in a number of parts of the book. He discussed Hitler's atrocities against the Jewish population in the occupied territories, and I'll quote him now, as a system of total extermination applied on a scale inconceivable to the human mind. Throughout, he gave a number of specific examples of massacres against the Jews, carried out in a number of cities, including Kiev. And he put the final solution into historical context, writing that, and I'll quote him again, "The Jewish people during their many thousands of years of existence have been more than once subjected to persecutions, but the Hitler atrocities surpass anything known to history." Now, I can't presume to know what Trajan's Jewishness meant to him. We don't have diaries or letters, although maybe they're out there and at some point we can learn more. But it clearly, I think we can say, meant something, right? We do know, though, that it ultimately and unfortunately ended up mattering to Stalin. In the late 1940s, Trajan, like many other Jewish professionals and cultural figures in the Soviet Union, fell victim to Stalin's anti-cosmopolitan campaign. His time abroad, his ties to Western lawyers, his Jewishness, they all became liabilities. Trajan escaped arrest. He was already older at that point and in ill health, but he was publicly rebuked as a rootless cosmopolitan and accused of participating in an anti-Soviet conspiracy. The irony of this could not have been lost on Trajan, who had helped develop the Soviet idea of criminal conspiracy in his legal writings. Even as Trajan fell out of favor in the Soviet Union, his concept of crimes against peace lived on and shaped discussions in the United Nations about international law. All the while, the American lawyer Murray Bernays ended up getting credit for coining the term. Trajan's contribution to the legal framework of the IMT was for a long time forgotten, just like the Soviet role in creating the IMT, and just like the Soviet contribution to the record of the Holocaust. His role in the IMT, along with the roles of other key Soviet participants, was forgotten in the West because of the Cold War. But it was also disparaged in the Soviet Union because of the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, because he was Jewish. All right, so to conclude, to retell the history of the Nuremberg Trials, to bring in the Soviet Union, means confronting the Nuremberg myth that developed during the Cold War. It means accepting a level of historical complexity. It also means confronting the Soviet version of history and bearing witness as a historian, not just to the crimes of Nazism, but also to the crimes of Stalinism. The real Nuremberg story is messy, but it's also necessary because Nuremberg still matters. For some, Nuremberg remains a gold standard for international justice. For others, it's an appalling example of victor's justice that should never be repeated. But if Nuremberg is going to offer meaningful lessons at all, we need this fuller and more complicated history. We need to understand what actually happened. Well, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to a conversation.
Thank you so much, Fran, for your illuminating talk. And I'm sure we'll have some questions from the audience as we await those. If you wouldn't mind just interrogating a little bit some of the things you have discussed in your talk. And perhaps if I could start with a more general question, which has to do with both the legacy of the Shoah and the occupied Soviet territories and with the legacy of the Soviet presentation of the Shoah. In other words, with that which actually happened and is historically documented and how it was presented in the Soviet Union. And of course, as a historian of these matters, you know so very well that from the very beginning, certainly from the very late fall of 41, early winter of 42, when the Soviets begin to gather systematic evidence. Particularly, we know this following the temporary liberation of the eastern Crimea, of the Kerch Peninsula, the earliest Shoah evidence. The level of the documentation is extremely detailed, and it continues to be very detailed and specific to the genocidal nature of what is happening, right? The Jewishness of the Jewish victims is not obfuscated. However, the official presentation as the Soviets move closer to the victory, and certainly, I would say, following Stalingrad and Kursk, begins to acquire the dimensions of universalizing Jewish suffering, presenting Jewish victims as peaceful Soviet citizens. It's never fully systematic, as you know, Francine, and as part of the challenge, it's never officially stated, so we have to sometimes infer the policy on the basis of the incompletely delivered rhetoric, but nevertheless, it is one of the challenges that we grapple with when we talk about this thing. So I guess what I wanted to hear from you a little bit more is the extent to which in the Soviet depositions at the Nuremberg trials, this tension is still manifested. In other words, the tension between laying out detailed evidence of the genocide of Jews and also Roma to some extent on the occupied territories, and the universalizing tendencies that these were peaceful civilians and Soviet citizens. So I guess that would be kind of my opening question.
Right. No, this is obviously one of the big questions, right? To what extent did the Soviets deny the Holocaust, right? I mean, that's kind of the gist of it in some ways. That's how I've heard it phrased from other people. By virtue of talking about peaceful Soviet citizens, right? And when we see even the earlier trials, like the Krasnodar trial and the Kharkov trial, there's a really big difference in some of the big press reports, especially the ones that are targeted towards letting the Soviet people know what's happened. They're talking about peaceful Soviet citizens, but at the same time, they'll talk about the number of Jewish victims. So they're not hiding it. It's a question of what the emphasis is. And when they're talking to an international audience, like through then I think it's clearly there's more of a detailed discussion about the Jewish victims, in part because they're appealing to an international audience that they presume cares about such things, right? So I mean, in some ways, I think the issue I have with this in some ways is that we can't without the I mean, at some point maybe we'll have documents. It's amazing to me the documents that I did find, things I didn't think existed, and they documented everything. So this is why I'm always hesitant to kind of think, well, what were they thinking about when they did this? Because I think that at some time we'll get the documents that give us a sense of how they were thinking about these things. I mean, I know that in terms of, again, what we have documents on the selection of members of the press corps. And we know when they were talking about selecting members of the press corps, they wanted to have representatives from, and the memos will say, from all the nationalities that have suffered at the hands of the Nazis. And they already had a number of Jewish representatives because there were a number of famous Jewish writers and artists. But then they made an effort to bring in journalists like from Ukraine and from Belarus and from the Baltic republics, right? So there's all along, they're conscious of nationality. They're thinking about this. But I guess I want to throw it back at you if I can, because I want to turn this more into a conversation because I want to know what you think too. The fact of talking about something as peaceful Soviet citizens, and I don't know the answer to this. It's something I've been thinking about a lot though. If part of the objective in doing so was not to replicate the Nazi language of segregating people according to race, of segregating people according to like, these ideas that the Jews are different, but if it was a part of a rallying cry to the Soviet people as a whole, so that the entire Soviet people would kind of rally in the war, is that a terrible thing, right, in and of itself? Does that mean that I mean, it's one thing if we saw that it was wiped out in everything and that they're not keeping track and they're not aware of it. But if we're talking about now is again, just like the publicity record, how they're talking about it. And again, this is in the middle of the war, some of these earlier trials. And the point of the trial is to rally the entire Soviet people behind the war effort. And the Jews are peaceful Soviet citizens. the same way that the Ukrainians are and the same way that the Belarusians are, right? I mean, they sort of fit into that category at the same time as you can talk about victims in terms of the specifics, and you can talk about victims in terms of the generality. And what do we read into that? So what do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Fran. I also just want to remind members of our audience that you are welcome and invited to pose your questions through the chat option, and Professor Hirsch will gladly take them. So I'm obviously not the invited speaker, but just the moderator. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I guess there's several pieces to this. There are many apologetic, positively and negatively apologetic ways of explaining the various reasons why the rhetoric of non-dividing the victims who were Soviet by citizenship, or as was the case with those who came from Eastern Poland, who became Soviet by citizenship, by non-dividing them into ethnic and national religious groups. And one could find justification in terms of the morale of the country. But I think fundamentally, the one big truth that is here obfuscated or if not erased, is that Jews and Roma were the only ethnic, historical, national groups that were being killed as Jews and Roma on the occupied Soviet territories. And the obfuscation that did obscure the genocidal nature of what the Nazis and their accomplices were doing. This is, if you ask for my take.
But I will say, so just one of the things that I was surprised when I then went back to the documents, and that I found that when they're not obfuscating it in the article in the articles that are published in the West, right? When they're publishing things to the West, they're in fact specifically talking about the targeting of the Jews. So they're playing to. I mean, so again, I don't have an answer here, but I find
also,
it interesting.
Francine,
They're playing to these different audiences.
They also developed something of a split personality disorder when it comes to presenting this evidence. In other words, they have virtually no problem speaking about the systematic murder of Jews in the death camps and concentration camps. But there's a reason for that. Those are not Soviet Jews, although they did include, those are Western or Central European Jews. To them, the whole rhetoric of non-dividing the death does not fully apply. That's my sense as well.
Well, and that's the point that I raised but didn't develop, because again, it's one of the, in terms of thinking about the witnesses that were called and not called, it was only in putting together this paper that I really started to think about the fact that the witnesses that they called to talk about the Holocaust, it's someone from Poland and someone from Vilna, right? And Budnik, who was the Jew from Ukraine, they make a decision not to call him. And
well, there's also, I'm sure you know 10 times better than I do, that they also did not choose some very obvious witnesses to the mass murder by members of the Einsatz group and there were about 8 people who survived Kerch who had ample testimony. There was one woman, for instance, who crawled out of the ditch. Her entire family was buried there. She gave plenty of evidence elsewhere. She would have been such a compelling witness, but you know, her name was Bill Tsarkovskaya. Why wasn't she chosen? So I do think there is something behind it.
No, there's something going right. But again, for me, I guess I tend to be pretty empirical about those kinds of things because I think that I'm just sure the documents exist. We just
of course, you're absolutely right. And I guess let me pause here because we have a question from the audience. But I just want to say, you know, when I was working on the Krasnodar trial and how the team in which Stalin took a personal interest was preparing it, there is still key evidence that is in classified archives. And I don't think a single Western historian has seen it, more or less along the lines of what you specify.
No, so, that's super interesting.
In other words, one day, I hope we will know the script
Yes, I think we will one day, right? It's
Okay, so
yeah.
we have our first question, which is great. Could you speak on what the reaction of the Americans and British were to the Soviet testimonies? Did they trust them to be in good faith? Interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's interesting in terms of thinking about the reaction to the testimony. The reaction to the French witness testimony and the Soviet witness testimony was very similar, and that is, I think that everyone, I mean, those who wrote about it later, like what we know from the memoirs, right? What we know from the letters and the documents, that people talked about that the witness testimony as being the most powerful part of the whole trial, the most powerful part of the case. At the same time, some participants in the trial, including some of the Western judges, thought it was unnecessary. And we have that. There's a great discussion in in Burkett's memoirs about the French witness testimony, where he talks about the fact that all of this is it's very like emotionally compelling, but we don't really need it. Like, what's the point? Like, we already know these things. Like, why drag this on and bring the witnesses in? So, but I didn't see questions about the veracity of what the witnesses were saying.
Very good. Thank you. We have more questions, which is great. And thanks so much for being so open to this interrogation. I mean, interrogation of history, not of your book. Your book is great.
No, it's I mean, again, I will say too that like the book isn't about the Jewish role per se. So this is a bit of a stretch, but it's really important. And I really appreciated the invitation to actually go back and think about the documents through this lens. So thank you.
Perfect. So we had a question which I think is connected with something I was asking about, but a little more specific, which is, was the Soviet role in the International Nuremberg Trials motivated in the way the Soviets might have tried to overshadow the Russian people's own history of persecuting Jews and pogroms? In other words, my sense is this question is also wondering if there is a kind of normative prejudice that casts a shadow over the Jewish evidence, of the Shoah-related evidence. That's how I understand it, I guess.
Right. I mean, I think in terms of, again, like, why did the Soviets want to participate in the Nuremberg trials? Like, why did they want to bear witness against Nazi atrocities? I mean, it was so, the deaths were so, like, what happened was so incredibly overwhelming, right? That of course the Soviets wanted to bring this evidence to bear and to show the world what had happened and to create a historical record of it. And I think so again, when we think about the significance of the trials, I think there are lots of ways we can think about it. Some people like to think about the significance in terms of what happens later with international law. Some people about like the verdicts, right? You know, the fact that they were not all found guilty, does that mean it wasn't significant? But I think that to go back and to read through the public testimony, like what was ultimately part of the trial transcript, but then also to go back and to read the depositions and to have all of that evidence and that record, I think that is, that's incredibly important. And so again, when the Soviets, what they wanted to present publicly, they wanted to shape the testimony a certain way. They really wanted, again, they wanted the emphasis to be on the crimes against the Soviet people as a whole, with the crimes against the Jews as a part of that. But if you go and dig into the depositions themselves and go and dig into the other evidence that they collected, it becomes incredibly important as a record. And I don't think that was motivated by wanting to cover up the crimes of the Stalin era. I don't think they weren't concerned about the crimes of the Stalin era.
Well, I guess here the observation could be, of course, when the first genocide convention was being put together, the Soviets were very concerned about not putting political genocide, because obviously to them it opened a venue for the investigation of Stalin's crime. But in any case, we have so many questions.
But that happens later. But that's later.
Exactly.
They're not concerned about including the term genocide at Nuremberg. They're not.
Just as the Southern senators are very concerned about racial crimes. In any case, we have a lot of questions now, so which is great. So we have a question from our good colleague Rochelle Rothschild. what evidence have you found about how closely Stalin followed and orchestrated the Soviet presence and arguments at Nuremberg?
Oh, this is great. Pretty closely, and there's really amazing evidence. The Foreign Ministry Archive was an incredible place to do research because there are things like, again, the marked up copies of the indictment that the Soviets smuggled out, the marked up copies of the judgment that they smuggled out. They were supposed to, I mean, the judgment was being discussed in closed quarters where they would like burn the trash every night. And yet the Soviet judge manages to get a copy out that goes all the way up to Stalin. So we have Stalin's handwriting on the indictment. We have Stalin's handwriting on the judgment. We have Stalin sending back detailed suggestions about how to argue this or that point. All of the major speeches, presentations, they're all screened. Not everything went all the way to Stalin. Sometimes it stopped at Wyszynski or Molotov, but Stalin, he was very involved. And again, when Rudenko went back to Moscow and other members of the delegation, we know that they met with Stalin, and we don't have the transcript of those conversations, but we have the protocols of the Politburo meetings that followed afterwards. So we can sort of get a sense of what the topics were, what the decisions were that was made. So Stalin followed very closely what was happening.
Thank you. And then we have a question that relates to George Ginsburg's book, The Soviet Road to Nuremberg. And the question is that in this book, Ginsburg claims that Aron Trayinin's rationale for a trial of Nazi leaders was to focus the anger of the Soviet public on them only, to facilitate peace. Do you find evidence that this was Trayinin's aim, so that the Soviet people would not hold a grievance against Germans as a whole?
I found no evidence of that. So, I mean, I think this is, again, that first of all, let me just say that George Ginsburg was an incredible scholar, and that is an incredible book. And that was one of the books that I read early on, where I got a sense of the importance of Trayinin, right, to the story. But again, it's the archives. I was able to do research in the Academy of Sciences archive and look at the discussions at the meetings of the Institute of Law that Trayinin was presenting early drafts of the book and the discussions about it. And so I would say, let me qualify that in the sense that one of Trayinin's innovations, right, was to say that you can hold leaders criminally accountable. So again, that you could try the leaders of a state. I haven't seen anything about his personal motivations vis-a-vis the German people, but we know that, and he wasn't the only one. The French were also very interested in this. And again, so there was lots of questions later about collective responsibility. But Trayinin was one of the people who helped develop the legal arguments for the trials of organizations like the SS and the Gestapo as well, where it was an argument for, again, Nuremberg, you try the leaders, but you're using that as a means to then try the members of the organizations that they represent.
Wonderful. Yeah. And now I have a question. I'm very pleased to say from a student at BC who is now in my seminar on Holocaust literature, Jackson Dansford. This is an undergraduate. And the question is, in what ways was the International Tribunal format successful? And in what ways does it fall short, specifically as it relates to the Nuremberg trial? Is the concept of justice within the International Tribunal different from the concept of justice within national tribunals? And just so you know, friend, we've been talking about the whole spectrum of trials, from Krasnodar, the national trials in Poland, and then up to the Eichmann trial and the Frankfurt trials in the seminar. So I think this is a very interesting question.
Oh, and it's a great question, and what a great class. So I say that one of the interesting things about the Nuremberg, first of all, so it's like there's so many interesting ways to get at this. There's a question of what does justice mean? And when you have 4 different countries coming together to hold a trial that have had very different experiences of the war. Remember, the Soviet Union and France, they were occupied. And so their experience of the war was very different from the American experience and different from the British experience. So there's different ideas there, but they're also, the countries are coming from very different legal systems. And so, yes, we can talk about the Soviet show trial, and that's a big part of it, but the Soviet and the French, they shared a civil law system, and the Americans and the British shared a common law system. So that too added certain nuances where there were certain expectations about how a trial would run and how a trial would function. That said, another reason that I think the Soviets end up being incredibly important to the whole thing, it's Training's ideas, but it's also the fact that the Soviets didn't have a problem with ex post facto law because they didn't have a problem with that in their legal system. And Nuremberg, you're bringing together 4 countries from 4 legal systems and you're picking and choosing what works. So I think, and they called it a military tribunal too, like recognizing that it wasn't going to look like a regular trial. So these are questions that everyone was thinking about at Nuremberg right from the start in terms of bringing in terms of like the nuances of the 4-power trial. The question of, do I think it was that it worked, that it was effective? I mean, on the one hand, it worked incredibly well, right? That and again, it depends on what you see as the end result. If the end result is to bring testimony to the world, to bring witnesses before the world, to create a record and to have all 4 countries coming together and do that, I think that there is, and again, what was the alternative? Like, would it have been better to just like shoot the Nazi leaders, right? In the end, maybe Stalin would have said yes, given that there were acquittals, but so it's, so yeah, what does justice mean? Like, was justice served? Nuremberg had its problems, but in the end, for that particular moment, I think it was a success. But could that success be carried over? The other thing I just want to add about Nuremberg that's really important is when they put together the Nuremberg Charter, they circumscribed it. They restricted things so that it was only the crimes of the European Axis powers that were being tried. And so that alone meant that you couldn't take what happened at Nuremberg and try to apply that law automatically afterwards. And so that created issues as well. So yeah, super interesting questions. I wish we could talk about it for an hour, actually.
Yeah, so we are beginning to run out of time, but I hope you don't mind, Fran, if we take one more question and then start wrapping it up. And okay. So this question has to do with the redrawing of the boundaries on the map of Europe. The question is that, as you know, the Red Army also investigated crimes committed against Jews on German soil. And especially the reference here is East Prussia, the first actual German territory that the Red Army came to. And the person who's asking the question is suggesting that East Prussia, the territory was during the Tehran and Yalta conferences granted to the Soviet Union as reparation. Would investigative efforts like this help serve as a justification that this area should be taken from Germany and handed over to the Soviet Union?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Again, I like the documents, and I'm pretty empirical in terms of how I like to work. And so I would bet that if that was the intention, there would probably be a document in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives talking about it. The other thing is that when the Soviets wanted to prove something, they didn't necessarily need fair trial to do it. I just want to give the example of the so-called trial of the leaders of the so-called Polish underground state that happened in the summer before Nuremberg in June 1945, which was a ridiculous show trial that was held in Moscow, where the Soviets, they tried like 17 members of the Polish underground who were completely anti-fascist, and they tried them as collaborators with the Nazis. And part of the justification part of that was for them to be able to kind of complete their process of taking hold over Poland. So the Soviets definitely viewed trials in an instrumental way. In terms of the particular of what was happening in Germany, that's a great research question.
Thank you. So in other words, Soviet civilization both reaffirms and compromises its values time and again, it seems, right? So before we wrap this up, Fran, I just wanted to ask a very specific question. I think I really, really loved the way you described Trainin's story and the irony that, one of the key legal minds of the Soviet testimony, Soviet contribution was then, of course, then became a cosmopolitan during the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, and really was spared, but really sidelined. In a sense, there's even greater irony in what happens to Sutzkever. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that, because of course he becomes Israeli and he lives a long, full life continuing to bear witness, to write about it.
Well, I mean, I think that, again, this is, right, if you really want to trace out what it meant to be Soviet or not be Soviet, right, Sutzkever is kind of pulled in at a particular moment to play a particular role. And then he doesn't have the same allegiance to the Soviet Union. He's not part of the Soviet system. He sees a way out, right, and he takes it. Whereas Trainin, you have someone who, I don't want to paint a picture of Trainin as purely like this innocent. I mean, he, in developing the concept of conspiracy, and I didn't have time to really get into this in this particular talk, but he starts developing the concept of conspiracy earlier on for the Moscow trials. He's already working with Vyshinsky at that point. Vyshinsky has had a huge influence on his career. So Trainin is part of the system. He is loyal to the system, and he doesn't see it coming, right? I think I would say, and again, like I would like to see the documents, but what I would say is that the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, all of it takes him completely by surprise. That it's not, he thinks and what we do know is that after Nuremberg, he goes around, and initially the Soviets sent him to Paris. He's giving lectures abroad. He sees himself, and he's giving lectures back at the Institute of Law on the future of Soviet criminal law. He thinks that these ideas of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity are going to be integrated into a new Soviet law code. He thinks Soviet international law experts have a beautiful and bright future. And then it all comes crashing down. So you could say on the one hand it's naivete, but he's not naive. He witnessed what happened during the Moscow trials, and so he sort of he bought into the system to a certain extent, and that same system did his in. It's sad, but it's not a straight up tragedy.
Right. Thank you, Fran, so much. We really appreciate your joining us this afternoon. And this was such an illuminating talk, and I think also very good questions. Thank you, and good luck with your current project. Thanks so much to all members of our audience, and we'll see you next week.